In this city prey to contrasts, the streets seemed to draw a canvas where elements of beauty and misery mixed together. Modern skyscrapers, majestic and gleaming with glass, stood proudly alongside old concrete buildings, disfigured by years of neglect. The upscale neighborhoods, with their luxury boutiques, elegant cafes and shiny cars, were just a stone's throw from the neglected areas, where entire families lived crammed into cramped, dilapidated apartments. The city lights, bright and sparkling, shone brightly in the evening, but masked the gloom that reigned in the less frequented streets. Amara grew up in this two-speed world, a universe where skin color and social origin demarcated invisible but very real boundaries. His skin, deep black, evoked the ancestral roots of a people who had endured the chains, exploitation, and violence of the past. Her ancestors, generations of women and men torn from their land, had crossed tumultuous oceans, had carried their suffering on their shoulders like a heavy and silent burden, and had survived hatred, injustice, and oppression. Every pigment in her skin told a story of resistance, survival, and resilience. She didn't know it yet, but Amara carried within her a legacy of dignity and courage. Despite this sometimes dark world, Amara was a joyful child, a ray of sunshine in an often cold and hostile environment. She possessed a luminous innocence, a rare ability to see the good in others, even in those who seemed to have lost everything. She observed the world around her with gentle curiosity and a generous heart. Where others would have seen misery, Amara saw souls seeking warmth and love. Every act of kindness she offered, no matter how small, was a response to the coldness of a world she didn't yet fully understand, but yearned to change. She lived with her mother, Adama, a strong woman, but marked by the struggles of life. Their days took place in a small apartment located in a working-class neighborhood, a modest but lively place, where we supported each other. The walls were painted a faded color, the furniture was old and worn, but there was immeasurable love that reigned in this home. Every evening, Adama came home from work tired, her arms full of laundry that she had washed and ironed for her employers in a local laundry. But, although exhausted, she always found time to smile at her daughter, to listen to her, to comfort her. The future was uncertain, but there was this unspoken promise between them. They would always support each other, no matter what. Amara spent her days at school, a place where she nurtured her dreams of a better future. She dreamed of a world where skin color would no longer be a criterion for determining a person's worth. She dreamed of a world where you could offer a smile, a meal, or an outstretched hand without fear of being judged. Every morning, when she put on her school uniform, she felt like she was carrying a dream, a secret mission. To change things, even if it was just for one person, even if this change had to start in the small actions of daily life. A few blocks from Amara's house, a man sat under a tree every morning, his only shelter from the icy wind and indifferent looks. Samuel. He was not a stranger to the city, but he was the one avoided. His face, weathered by the years and the harshness of life, bore the marks of a difficult existence, marked by poverty, solitude, and abandonment. His clothes were torn, his hands calloused, but his eyes were lively, alert, almost furtive, as if he were constantly scanning an invisible horizon, looking for something he might never find. Every day he sat there, under the shade of this solitary tree, waiting for the few coins thrown by hurried passers-by or the scraps left by those who had hearts big enough to offer him a little of their wealth. The wind often blew cold at this time of year. The leaves of the trees danced in the air, but Samuel remained there, implacable, like a silhouette frozen in a setting that he had accepted, without illusion. Through Amara's eyes, he became a character who symbolized the reality that many preferred to ignore, that of the forgotten, the invisible, the left behind. And yet, despite this image of solitude, Samuel was not just homeless. He was a man, a human being, with a story, dreams, and wounds. Amara knew it. She had seen him almost every day, observing him discreetly, her heart sinking at each encounter. Something about him disturbed her deeply. It wasn't pity she felt, but a kind of silent sadness, an instinctive empathy that pushed her to want to act. Amara felt that this old man was not just there by chance. It was part of his world, of his daily life, just like the buildings, the trees, and the passers-by. It was a facet of the city that could not be ignored, but that everyone nevertheless chose to miss. One afternoon, while returning from school, Amara noticed him. This time he didn't seem to have eaten. The other passers-by crowded around without even giving him a glance. Amara's heart sank. She had no specific reason, no defined plan. She only had her intuition and a great desire to share a little of what she had. This little that seemed like a mountain compared to what she didn't have. As she left the small grocery store her mother had sent her to, Amara was holding a sandwich, which she intended to devour for her snack. But at the sight of Samuel, a slight movement occurred within her. A spontaneous, natural impulse. Without thinking further, she approached, her steps hesitant but determined. She held the sandwich towards him and in a soft voice asked him, "Are you hungry, sir?" Samuel stared at her for a moment, as if this question came from another time, from another reality. His eyes softened, a glimmer of astonishment and gratitude crossed his face marked by suffering. He shook his head slowly, as if he didn't really want to accept the offering from a little girl whom he probably considered just a passerby. But he still murmured a thank you, so faint that the air seemed to absorb it. Amara did not hesitate. With incredible gentleness, she replied, "I will get something to eat for you tomorrow." There was nothing thoughtful in his words, nothing calculated. It was an unconditional promise, a childhood oath. Without turning around, she walked away, her mind occupied by this image. A solitary man who rarely ate, whose soul seemed to be lost by waiting in the shadows. But, that night, she knew she would do whatever it took to light up some of that darkness. And every day, from that moment on, she would bring a little warmth and hope into his life, as a gesture of silent revolt against the indifference of the world around him. Every day, a little more, she understood that kindness, even the smallest, could bring life back to life where everything seemed frozen in the harshness of everyday life. The next day, as Amara returned from school, she felt a strange tension in the air, like a presentiment that made her quicken her pace. The police sirens, howling and shrill, tore through the usual tranquility of his neighborhood. It was as if the wind itself was caught in the storm. A patrol car, its lights flashing in a frenzied rhythm, parked right in front of the apartment building where she lived. Her heart sank instantly, a strange worry seizing her, a nameless fear that seemed to come out of nowhere. This was not normal. Nothing this violent ever happened here. She stopped wide-eyed, watching the two police officers standing near her apartment door. One of them, a man with a face marked by age and experience, spoke in a low, calm voice to the mother of a neighbor. The other, a woman, scanned the entrance to the building, visibly tense. Amara felt sweat beading on her forehead as she advanced slowly, her steps uncertain, her stomach knotted with anxiety. Why were they there? What was happening? She didn't have an answer yet, but a certainty was gradually forming. Something serious was brewing. When she got closer, one of the police officers suddenly turned his head towards her. He looked at her for a moment, as if measuring the distance between them, before breaking the silence with a cold, authoritarian voice. "You are Mrs. Adama's daughter, aren't you?" he asked, his expression hard, his eyebrows furrowed. Amara nodded, nausea rising within her at the force of the situation. "Yes, it's me." "What's going on, sir?" she replied in a voice that betrayed the worry that was growing within her. She had barely finished her sentence when the other agent, a younger woman, came forward as well. His eyes were piercing, almost accusatory, and his gaze fell on Amara with an intensity that made the little girl shiver. "We received a report," the woman explained in a voice she wanted implacable. "You give meals to a homeless man. It's dangerous, and it might be against the law. This kind of gesture attracts attention, and we need to know why you are behaving this way." Amara felt a rush of heat rising in her cheeks. His thoughts were racing, and a dull panic invaded his mind. She hadn't done any harm. Why did the police think what she was doing was dangerous? Why could an act of kindness be perceived as a threat? Words were rushing through her head, but she couldn't find the right ones to explain. She didn't understand. Why had they deemed a simple sandwich, an apple, as a suspicious act? Why did generosity and compassion become reprehensible behavior in this world which sometimes seemed to invert the simplest values? She didn't have time to respond, taken aback, overwhelmed by the speed of the interrogation. The police did not seem to believe for a moment that his actions were motivated by a simple desire to do good. They did not understand the purity of his gesture, nor the kindness of a child who only followed his heart. The simple act of feeding a man already broken by life, seemed to be seen as a deviant act, as if there was something wrong with the humanity of this act. As his mind raced, his gaze fell on his mother, who had just arrived, late as always, her purse still on her shoulder, and her work uniform, still soaked with the smell of soap and detergent. Adama, who had experienced the harshness of the world with its own share of suffering and injustice, rushed forward when he saw the police. The young woman's face immediately froze, and a glimmer of terror flashed in her eyes. She knew that the authorities never looked kindly on gestures of kindness, especially when they came from people like them, people from the bottom of the social ladder, the invisible. "What's going on here?" Adama asked in a trembling but firm voice, a mixture of fear and anger. The agent, who appeared to be the oldest, stared at her coldly before answering. "Your daughter fed a homeless man, ma'am." He paused, as if the inconceivable was imposing itself on him, and continued, "This is behavior that could lead to problems. We have to check." Amara looked at her mother, her heart sinking more and more. She knew Adama would react. But in that moment, anxiety crept into her, this visceral fear that they were caught in a situation from which it would be impossible to escape. Why did they always have to be judged, condemned before even being listened to? Why were people like them, like Samuel, never given the right to understanding? Adama, although furious, tried to remain calm. She explained that her daughter had simply wanted to help, that there was no malicious intent, that it was a gesture of pure humanity. But his words met a wall of coldness. The police didn't listen. They only heard what they wanted to hear. An act of generosity, a sandwich given to a man who had nothing, a very simple act, became a crime in their eyes. The neighborhood, already plagued by long tensions between the authorities and residents, was not a place where the police were welcomed with open arms. Relations between the police and the population were tinged with distrust, resentment, and injustice. The authorities, omnipresent, but rarely benevolent, were always looking for a reason to upset the fragile peace of the sector. And this situation, which they considered strange, aggravated an already heavy climate of suspicion. The police, in their habit of considering anything out of the ordinary as suspicious, had taken this gesture of kindness as a provocation. A small gesture of generosity became a source of danger, a call for intervention. They didn't understand that a child could still see the world through innocent eyes, that a simple gesture could be an act of pure kindness. Adama, struggling with his own anger, tried to calm the situation, but the police were unwilling to understand. Their minds were already made up. The image of the young girl feeding a homeless man, a man rejected by society, had become a pretext to intimidate them, to remind them that their place, as marginalized beings, was not to interfere with the established order. The situation was further complicated when one of the officers, after inspecting the area, noticed that Samuel, as was his habit every evening, had disappeared. The homeless man had vanished into the dark street, blending into the anonymity of the night. This left the police distraught. They had no physical evidence, no direct witnesses. Samuel, although at the heart of the matter, was now out of reach. But this absence only fueled the idea that there was something darker, something more mysterious behind this gesture. For them, this confirmed their suspicions. There must be a hidden reason, an obscure intention behind Amara's act of generosity. The next morning, the investigation took a more serious turn. The affair was now out of control, an uncontrollable spiral of accusations and misunderstandings. The police, unable to prove anything concrete, decided to launch an official investigation. Amara and her mother were summoned to the police station for a statement. Amara, although young and innocent, became the center of this absurd investigation. The full weight of a society that understood neither poverty, nor compassion, nor acts of kindness fell on her. This simple act, feeding a homeless man, had suddenly taken on disturbing proportions. The gaze of society, which she barely perceived, was now focused on her. We saw her as a child who had disrupted the natural order of things, a child who, through her act of generosity, had broken a norm that had been imposed on her without her ever being fully aware of it. At the court hearing, the case seemed to descend into ridicule. The accusations against Amara and her mother were as vague as they were baseless. There was no evidence of malice, no criminal intent, just a human act, pure in its intent. However, the presence of the police, the palpable anguish of her mother, the tense atmosphere of the hearing, all of this deeply marked Amara. She felt both a witness and a victim of a system that no longer knew how to recognize the simplicity of good. The judge, although he was skeptical and visibly embarrassed by the turn of the case, had to follow the procedure. The judicial machinery was set in motion, almost indifferent to the absurdity of the situation. The story became a point of discussion for local media, which, far from trying to understand, fueled a distorted and contemptuous narrative about poverty and inequality, stigmatizing the most vulnerable and their actions. The cameras were focused on Amara and her mother, but neither lens sought to see the beauty of the gesture. Journalists, too happy to seize on such an event, were only looking for sensationalism, amplifying confusion, feeding fear of the unknown. For them, it was not a story of solidarity, but a story to be scandalized, to be transformed into a debate on security, public order, the norm. In their eyes, Amara had become a deviant figure, an example of what not to do. And then, like lightning breaking through a dark night, came an unexpected twist. Samuel, the homeless man, appeared in court one morning, his body thin, but his voice strong and full of dignity. He had not been forced to surrender, no one had pushed him to testify. He had come by himself, guided by recognition and truth. As he entered the room, he was greeted by curious looks, but he did not let himself be intimidated. He turned to the judge, head held high, and began to speak. He told his story, that of this little angel he had met in the street, Amara. He spoke of her with a gentleness that clashed with the coldness of the place. He explained how, every day, this little girl, without ulterior motives or judgment, had reached out to him, offering him a little bread, a little warmth in a world that rejected him. Samuel recounted how, at each meeting, Amara not only made the gesture of giving him food, but also that of giving him a little dignity, a little respect. "She never looked at me like I was worthless," he said, his voice broken but firm. "She looked at me like a man." The court froze for a moment, as if time had stood still. For the first time since the start of this absurd procedure, the eyes of judges, police officers and lawyers were focused on the humanity of the situation. Samuel, by his presence, by his words, had succeeded in breaking down the wall of suspicion and incomprehension which surrounded the affair. Amara's generosity was no longer a suspicious act, but a pure act, of precious rarity. His truth was that of human goodness, simple but irrefutable. When the trial ended, despite everything, the injustice slowly began to dissipate. Amara's gesture, although misunderstood by some, finally resonated as a symbol of what was purest in humanity: selfless generosity. This gesture, which, in the eyes of the police and certain members of society, had almost been criminalized, was in reality an act of gentle rebellion against a system which too often forgot the most vulnerable. From that day on, a strange feeling of relief coursed through Amara. She was still a child, but she now knew that she had succeeded in illuminating a universal truth. In a world where indifference has become the norm, even the smallest actions can be acts of revolution. Amara, although she did not seek it, had become a symbol. She was no longer just a little girl from a working-class neighborhood. She was the emblem of a silent resistance against the most subtle injustices, those that go unnoticed in everyday life, but which, when brought to light, forever change the perception of those who see them. The residents of the neighborhood, too, changed their outlook. Amara was no longer a child like the others. She had become an example, a model of what must be preserved in a world where kindness was becoming an exception. She was no longer invisible. She had become a beacon of hope in a city suffocated by fear and indifference.